Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right, everybody, welcome back to a Wild Ag Podcast. Today, we have an awesome set of speakers. We're going to talk about some mountain lion research, and I'm going to kick it over here to my co-host, Nathan Pfluger, who's going to kick things off.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. I'm really excited about today's episode. When we were going through picking topics for the ones that we wanted to start out with, mountain lions was really at the top of my list, just to help get some information out to the general public, because when you're out there, there seems to be a lot of misconceptions around this species. So anytime we can get some new information out to those landowners, get some educational materials out, I think it's really good. So today we are with Jason Clark and Sam Wilson. And I had the opportunity of going to undergrad with Jason, so that's kind of how this connection came about.
So he can tell some stories then? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. For another day, hopefully. But yeah, so
podcast.
Please introduce yourselves and we can go from there.
I'm Sam Wilson. I'm the Furbearer and Carnivore Program Manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. And I work out of Lincoln, and I work with the fur-bearing mammals, which are the mammals with valuable fur that are often trapped or hunted. And then I also work and coordinate our mountain lion research statewide.
I'm Jason Clark, and I work for the Nebraska Forest Service. I'm a conservation forester out of North Platte. And right now I generally help landowners with like fuels reduction projects, managing different tree species and things like that. So.
That's awesome. Heck yeah. Before we jump into it, Sam, can you give us a little background just on mountain lions in Nebraska?
Sure.
A little history there to kick us off.
You bet. The history is actually pretty fascinating for me. They're a native species. They were here for thousands of years. They were wiped out during settlement, like a lot of the other big wildlife species that were found here, bison and other animals. Actually, most of the large animals here that are native to Nebraska were either wiped out or nearly wiped out. And so, like an example with deer was, in one of the Nebraska Land articles long ago, said something like in around 1920, there were like between 100 and 200 deer statewide. There were no elk. There were not really turkeys. And so it was a dark time for wildlife back at, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and mountain lions were wiped out. I think the last one was found in the Pine Ridge around 1890.
Wow.
Where there's good habitat. And of course it was farther west, and I think it took longer out there to eradicate them. And they were gone for about 100 years. There were some odd reports here and there, and it's likely maybe, a few lions walked through, but we weren't actually able to prove that with evidence until 1991. So, and that actually was a mountain lion that was found in the Pine Ridge, basically just a few miles from where the very last mountain lion was killed in 1890.
That's interesting.
It's kind of a good reminder that if you have good habitat and you're near a source population, in this case, that was mountains in Wyoming and in the Black Hills, that wildlife can recover if they're protected through game law, which mountain lions were, and walk on back. And so the key there was that in the 1960s, so mountain lions were previously seen as a predator that should be eradicated, and there were bounties paid by states. And in the 1960s, there was a change in attitude to where people saw mountain lions as a valuable game animal, a trophy animal that they would like to harvest and pursue. And so Western states changed their laws to make mountain lions and a game animal. And then, of course, their prey species, deer and elk, and bighorn sheep and turkeys and coyotes and porcupines and all the other things that lions eat, had recovered through protections by state game agencies. And so in 1991, those populations in the Rockies were filling back in because of those protections in the Rockies. And then they recolonized the Black Hills and portions of the Pine Ridge in Nebraska. I think we had our first documented kit in about 2007.
Oh, cool.
So that's kind of the deep history is that they're native here for thousands of years. They were gone for about 100 years, but have walked back in on their own. And they're back in Nebraska.
Very neat.
That's super cool.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that hunters were the ones kind of pushing for that to have the laws and regulations around them to protect them, and I mean bring that viable population back. That's
it was
neat.
a mix. Yeah,
Okay.
there were definitely people who were more interested in just having all native species recovered,
sure.
and then but people, especially houndsmen, wanted to have this species to pursue, and that's their passion, is to go out with their dogs and hunt. So it was a mix.
Yeah, very neat. So when did we actually start doing some research then around the species here in Nebraska?
Yep.
Like Jason's project, or before that even?
Yeah, well, we did investigations and observations, and those go back to before 1991 when we made that first documentation of a cougar up there in the Pine Ridge. But it got more serious in about 2010. That's when we started our first scat detector dog surveys, where we used a specially trained dog to go out and find lion scats.
That's pretty cool.
We sent that up to a genetics lab in Montana, and they basically could tell us how many different lions and of which gender they were that we detected in the Pine Ridge. And that was so 2010, when we got those results back, was the first moment where we really got to peer into this new population. And like I mentioned, our first kitten was documented in 2007. So we started up really quickly after this population really formed. And we've been running genetic surveys every other year or every year since 2010. And then in 2015, we started our big cougar GPS collaring project.
Oh, okay.
And that allows us to take an even more fascinating look into what lions are eating, how big their home ranges are, how far, how far are they dispersing? Because as people probably know, these lions can walk hundreds of miles.
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing.
Which is amazing in and of itself.
Yeah.
Not to get off on a rabbit trail, but for people out there interested in, so you said scent detection with a dog. So like what, or scat detection, I should say. So what, can you just briefly explain like what that is, for people who have no idea? Because I would probably think of like a drug, enforcement dog, and you have, it's kind of similar idea, but
It's the dream job for any dog in this world, is to hike through beautiful canyons and woodlands and search for cat poop.
That's pretty cool.
So the key here is that, we have this population of lions out in a really hard to get around landscape with steep canyon walls and forests. And lions don't want to be counted. They're super secretive. As we were talking before the podcast here, that it's really hard to see a wild lion. They don't want to be seen. They want to flee people. They want to hide and do their thing often at night. So they're hard to count. But they do leave scat around, when they're moving around through their home ranges. And so we can take this specially trained dog, and it's trained to find mountain lion scat. And we have a handler also that watches the dog and its behaviors. And when it finds mountain lion scat, we reward it with a tennis ball.
Oh, really?
Throw that tennis ball. It's got a rope on it. We tug it, swing the dog around, and let it get
That's pretty cool.
jaw in time. And it'll work all day long for pulling on the tennis ball. So that, that's the right kind of wage that Game and Parks can pay. So we do hire the dog and the handler, but
that's pretty cool.
They find these scats, and of course, much of the scat has the genetic material from the prey species, but the anterior portion has sloughed off epithelial cells from mountain lions, and so that's the part that helps us identify how many lions are out in the landscape.
Oh, interesting. That's pretty cool.
And then, of course, we GPS each of the locations where we find a scat. Get the genetic results back, and then we can kind of piece out, how far apart these scats are and get an idea of where these mountain lions are using and how many there are.
And I think that's really cool, like just from the standpoint, even being in this realm with my program of kind of trying to estimate wildlife abundance. It's hard.
It is.
And I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand how complicated that is. Because one, they're not like in a fenced in area. They're out there roaming around, and you got to be able to find ways to be able to, and some of them obviously think about like deer, you have the females are going to look very similar. So you have probably a similar situation where you don't, unless you're maybe tigers, I've seen where they've used stripe patterns to be able to take and detect and use that to estimate. But again, it's not like they have a big number one on their side and you can count them that way. It's really difficult.
It is difficult.
So
the few jaguars that cross the border into the United States, those jaguars have unique spots.
And absolutely.
You can put trail cameras on each side of the cat and basically look at the pattern of where the spots are and identify individuals. But for mountain lions, the scientific name used to be Felis concolor, and Felis, of course, is cat. And then concolor is of one color. So they do not look different. Sometimes you can tell a male from a female by a big blocky head and kind of a scarred face from fights and stuff. But they're hard to
Just
they're hard to count.
Hard to count, yeah, which makes it challenging and trying to, and again, ultimately we're estimating these populations out there, whether we're doing mountain lions, turkeys, deer, or whatever. So
yeah. So kind of digging into that a little more, what is our current number of unique individuals within the state based off current research?
So we don't have a statewide estimate. Our most established population is in the Pine Ridge. So I should mention there are 3 reproducing populations right now with resident animals, and that's in the Pine Ridge, which is out by Chadron and Crawford, on the Niobrara River Valley, which is by Valentine, Bassett, that kind of stretch, Ainsworth, and then down in the Wildcat Hills by Scotts Bluff and Garrett. And then, of course, there are dispersing animals that can show up anywhere in the state and have in the past, including some of the towns and cities in Nebraska and then in states beyond us. But there are those 3 areas that have animals that are there year round, adult males and females that reproduce and have kittens. And so the most established population there up in the Pine Ridge, we have done surveys there since 2010. And the most recent survey with the results was from 2021, and that was 33 total animals. I think we detected 21 unique individuals through our genetic survey. But I want to point out to all the landowners or people from the Pine Ridge who might be listening who are thinking, man, my ranch is so huge, I don't think you could count every cougar and be sure about it.
Sure.
We agree with you.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
That the landscape is big, it's hard, it's hard to detect everything. And so it's important for our listening audience to know that we detected 21 cougars, but we know there are some out on that landscape that we did not detect. And that's what the population estimators do.
Yeah.
And so when we estimate a population, it includes a number that the data allowed or shows us is likely there, even though we didn't detect it. So, but 33 was our most recent population estimate. We just completed a survey and we're crunching the numbers now, and it looks like it's going to be higher. This survey was completed in May and June of 2023.
Oh, okay.
So the next population estimate will likely be higher, but we're not done with that estimate yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Well, I suppose we can turn back to the main topic of discussion, which is some of the research that actually went on because you were able to collect all these scats. So I guess what led to the project, first of all?
Well, I think what led to it is, I had Teresa Frank, Dr. Frank from Chadron, come up to me and ask me if I would be interested in doing some research like this, which I was. And so that's kind of how it got started, and then talks with Sam as well. So essentially, I think there was some grant funding there. Is that correct?
That's right.
And they wanted to utilize scats from the surveys and do more with them other than just look at the genetic stuff, but also look at diet as well. And kind of like Sam mentioned earlier, being able to try and identify maybe items consumed that are smaller. As opposed to when you're using like GPS cluster investigation stuff, you're going to be able to find caches and some of the larger species that are being consumed. But with this method of research, you can kind of look at some of the smaller species that were consumed.
Oh, that's cool.
So
that's neat.
So that's kind of what led to it, I guess.
Yeah.
So when there's a research going on, partners is a huge part of that. Who were the partners, or who, helped to get this research off the ground? Maybe Sam can mention that a little more, or is it just strictly the Game and Parks?
I could start and then, mention a few, but so Nebraska is 98% privately owned, and no wildlife research or management or conservation really works unless you get private landowners involved.
Yep.
So our team in the Pine Ridge out of the Ponderosa office and the folks in Alliance helped us get permission from landowners to run our surveys. So there are literally dozens of private, mostly cattle ranches in the Pine Ridge that we surveyed with this detector dog. We also partnered with the Forest Service for permission, and then surveyed Game and Parks properties. So there are a lot of different, landowners that we had to contact to do these surveys where cougars use that type of habitat. And then, of course, working with Chadron State College and Teresa Frank there for Jason's project. Yeah. And then the other partner, I guess, would be the work that the U.S. Forest Service Genetics Lab in Montana did for us to identify, to make sure that what Jason was looking at were cougar scats, because sometimes the dog will pick up a bobcat scat or something else. And of course, that wouldn't apply to the project that Jason's doing.
Sure. Yeah. And it's really good you mentioned about the partners there, Sam, because I think and you mentioned with landowners, in a state like Nebraska, ultimately conservation comes back to them and what they do in their land. And so there's huge partners in many of the projects that I'm involved in. For example, the Pronghorn project, we had over 300 plus landowners we worked with in Western Nebraska. Being able to take and go out and helicopter capture pronghorn and collar them, it's a lot. And, a lot of knocking on doors, phone calls, all that kind of fun stuff. And so very grateful for the landowners, very grateful for the various other conservation agencies and organizations, because without that support, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing ultimately. So I appreciate you mentioning all that.
Yeah, very true. So you collected all these scats. First of all, how many did you have? And then just talk us through the process of digging through mountain lion scat and what you found.
Well, so I think I counted like 348 positive scats.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Just from everything that was collected and stored. So that's where I started. So separating, all of those. I mean, they were already partially separated by like years and everything,
Sure.
that they were collected. So from that point, then I kind of did, I selected 125, they're randomly selected scats to go through. So I didn't want to, pick so many from one year. I wanted to work with everything that I had,
sense.
right? So that's what I did that. And then after that, this was the fun part. Things get a little nasty, but so I essentially took these scats and put them in like soapy water, and I'd let them sit for 2 or 3 days to break up. And then after that, I would also kind of nasty, but I would run these scats through 3 different size sieves. So it would collect any type of hair or any other matter that was consumed. And then after that, I would put them in, and you probably remember this, Nathan, but the plant dryer at the college. So then I would put them in there and let everything dry.
Oh, that's
and then from there, obviously I could organize everything by sample ID, and then I could go through those samples. So
that's really interesting.
But I guess I'll keep just going on about the
process. I think it's good. And maybe I'll just note, like, for people who are out there listening, like, these are things that we do, going through scat. Like, this is some normal things. And some people may say, well, that's kind of weird. Do you guys do that kind of stuff? But ultimately,
no air conditioning. It's summertime, but it's got a little bit.
But these are ways that we can identify as you're going to get into probably here, species and things like that they're consuming. So,
Yep. So after essentially, so sample prep, we'll call it, that was first. And then from that point on, what I would do is I would randomly select 20 hairs from each sample, because I wanted to be able to, detect, multiple species if there were some, in a sample. So I found that methodology and some other research that was done in a different diet study.
Sure.
So I did that. So for, all 125 samples, I went through 20 hairs per sample. And then you'd also have other things in there too, like bone fragments. I had like a few like really small like feathers. So I would save that stuff as well. So I have all that saved. So, but yeah, that's essentially, that's the gist of what I would do. And I say randomly select 20 hairs. So what I was doing was I was looking at medular configurations within those hairs. So in the structure of a dorsal guard hair, so is what they call it. It'll have it's kind of a blank space, but it also have like cells in it that you can use to identify. I actually brought kind of a picture.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Wow. Book.
Absolutely. That's really cool.
So using that in this resource, I used a couple other resources as well that, from research looking at different hair and trying to identify species. And sometimes I'd only get it down to like a genus. But yeah, that's essentially what I did. So I'd use the hair to try and figure out what has been consumed, and then also bone fragments, feathers, and I did have like some eggshells, which was really interesting.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
That was probably the most interesting thing.
Yeah,
the eggshells.
Yeah.
Lions have to have breakfast too.
Yeah, that's true.
So out of all of these samples, what was kind of the most common prey animal that you found across?
Sure. So the most common, I guess, animal I found or species found would be deer.
Oh, sure.
Unfortunately, I couldn't when I first went into this research, I really wanted to try and be able to differentiate between mule deer and whitetail deer, because up in the Pine Ridge area, you have that overlap in species range. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that, just because I think a lot of it had to do with, I'd use a reference collection, right, of hairs, and a lot of times with the hairs that I went through a sample, you wouldn't get a full hair.
Yeah,
so that it made it kind of tough because they look so similar between the two underneath a microscope. So so unfortunately, I had that classified down to deer. So that was the most commonly found hair, and then second would have been cougar, actually.
Oh, interesting.
From cleaning themselves more from cleaning themselves?
I think it was probably most likely because of just general grooming behavior. And I don't know.
That's interesting.
Sam could speak to that, but it's pretty common in cougars.
Yeah, I mean, they're just a big cat. So if you look at your farm cat or your house cat,
that's true.
They're licking their paw there. It's the same. It's the same with cougars.
Yep.
Pretty cool.
So that's what I had second. I guess I'll just go down the list.
Yeah, sure.
Into it. And then I had porcupines.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
It sounds bizarre, but for some reason, lions that we've looked at going all the way back to 91 have had porcupine quills that we find inside, when we do a necropsy in their forearms or in their chest or their chin. And they seem to really love that taste, I guess. I can't imagine why they would go out.
Yeah, that's
and in fact, some of the scats we would pick up in our surveys would just be literally a tube of porcupine quills.
Really?
Just
can't imagine that going. I can't imagine that going through their system. Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
And that was really common too in the scats. Like, I would find hair of porcupine.
Oh, sure.
Most of those samples, it would be full of quills as well.
Interesting.
So, which is a pretty, that made it really easy to identify or learn how to identify.
Absolutely. Yeah, that probably had to feel good. Oh, that's a porcupine.
Yep. So, and then I had a classification of like smaller rodents.
Oh, okay.
That one was really tough to get down to.
I imagine
species. So for the purpose of this research, I just went with rodents.
Yeah,
talking really small rodents. And a lot of times I'd have a lot of bone fragment too.
Oh yeah.
You would see too. So like kind of like pocket gophers.
Oh yeah.
I think I forget which one it was. There's several different species of pocket gophers in Nebraska, but I did have some of those in samples. And then I guess my next one down the list as far as frequency was avian remains.
Okay.
So that would be feathers.
Sure.
Really small feathers, or I had like a piece of a calamus, so I guess it'd be a piece of a feather, but the end of a feather. Yep. I had that in a sample, and then also the eggshells I classified as avian remains. So
So with those avian remains, like, I assume cats will take turkeys. And I think about, being up there in Chadron last winter and some of the sites we're capturing turkeys at. And I'm just like overwhelmed by how many birds are at some of these wintering areas, hundreds. And so I suspect those areas would be fairly easy for some of those cats to be able to capture some of those turkeys. So I suspect turkeys would be a component. I'm not saying maybe regular, but is that something that could be a component of their diet?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that, I guess like when we use the GPS collars to look at cluster kill sites where the cats hang out for many hours, we would go in and look at those, and the vast majority, 80% were deer, which is kind of what we expected. But we did have a couple that were turkeys, and so they'll take turkeys if they can. Turkeys are super aware and fly up into the tops of trees and stuff. So they're cats don't absolutely hammer them, but they'll eat them if they can, and coyotes and other animals.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that's just interesting that they go for some of the smaller species too. Like I didn't even think about pocket gophers or anything like that. That's just interesting.
Yeah.
How do your findings stack up to the other research that's out there in other states? Is it pretty uniform, or?
I mean, I don't know if uniform is the correct word, but I mean, there were some similar, results in other scat research. So yeah, I have, let's see here. I was looking at this today. So like occurrence of deer detected, in some studies, it would, like greater than 30%. There was research in Canada, Arizona, and then also Utah. So that kind of is similar to what I got as far as frequency, a greater than 30%. frequency. So that was similar. But like I kind of mentioned, I think the biggest thing that was, I guess, different would have been like the avian remains. Like you just didn't see that frequency in other scat research or cougar scat research. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
That is interesting.
So
yeah,
we've had trail camera pictures of cougars. So like we'll have baits out or trail cameras over a cougar kill site, and there'll be things that happen like an owl hopping down on that prey that the cougar has killed, trying to get an extra snack.
Yeah.
And then, okay, if you're going to show up and be a different flavor, you get the side course.
Sure.
And so we've had, cougars kill owls and raccoons and coyotes and other animals that are drawn into the deer that they kill.
And that's what I was going to actually ask you about. Yeah, just kind of expound on that a little bit. And I was thinking even from the avian side, like what other, thinking turkeys, owls, what other potential type of avian? I know you maybe weren't able to get down to the super detailed nitty gritty of it, but you guys have any ideas, maybe any past work that's out there to kind of illustrate some other species?
Man, when I was looking through other research, it was really low occurrences. Right?
Sure.
So I think one of them I saw was turkeys, wild turkeys. And then the other ones, I think were from somewhere I think it was down in Mexico, but it was, unidentified birds. So, something probably,
it's hard to find it. Yeah.
Especially when it goes through that digestive tract.
Oh, so, sure. Yeah.
And some of these smaller animals, like we were talking about pocket gophers and some of these avian species that cougars are eating, and sometimes rabbits and other animals like that. I think these cats cover huge home ranges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our collared animals have walked 20 miles in one day of canyons and woods. Wow. And I think if they're walking along in a rabbit or a mouse or something runs in front of them, they'll scoop it.
They'll grab it,
because they're on their way looking for deer or trying to patrol their big, territory. So they're not going to pass an opportunity up.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that makes sense.
Very opportunistic for sure.
Sure.
Yeah. Interesting. Really cool. So with the findings from this research, how does that factor into your management implications just of the species? Or is that kind of what you were hoping for, that you could then decide different management techniques because of what you found?
It does help us. So when we looked with the GPS collars at their impacts on big game prey species, so we're trying to make sure the cougar populations are balanced in a way that deer and elk and bighorn sheep can maintain healthy populations, and also cougars themselves have a healthy population. And I just want to mention for your listening audience really quick, I use cougar and mountain lion interchangeably. It's the same animal.
Sure.
They're both common names for the exact same species. But I just wanted to mention that real quick.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's a good call.
It's a good, Jason's project is good for like informing us of actual natural history of this animal and what it's eating out in the landscape, besides just the big game species that we could detect with our previous research. And then also looking at rates, it can change a little bit how many deer, for instance, you may presume a cougar would kill in a year, if you knew that it's also eating a good number of rabbits and rodents and birds and coyotes and porcupines and other animals. Sure. So it does have some impact, Yeah,
and I think also too, it just provides this, like you're saying, that kind of natural history kind of provides that perspective to the general public as well about what, because there's probably a lot of assumptions about, what they may be consuming. And so it kind of provides some more hard facts and data to kind of help support that.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And you mentioned balanced population, which obviously we all want. We don't want it too low or too high. So what are some of the challenges that come along with mountain lion management within a dominated ag landscape? Can you speak on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is quite a challenge. I grew up in Nebraska. I grew up a few miles outside of a small rural town.
Sure.
And I completely understand that having an animal like a mountain lion, the fourth largest cat species in the world, in our ag dominated state, where a lot of the land that it uses are cattle ranches.
Sure.
They have the rules we have for them, and the management we have for mountain lions has to work within the agricultural landscape.
Sure.
That's number one. It has to work. And so we created some laws. We helped create laws with a state senator from the Western Panhandle that are really common sense, that allow us to remove animals that are depredating livestock or threaten people. So common sense laws that allow people to live with this big predator on the landscape. But then you also have, Game and Parks responding to any depredation calls and investigating. And And then you have this other issue, like we kind of mentioned how many lines you can have out there, but of social tolerance.
Sure.
And so just like with deer,
Yep.
we could have a lot more deer in Nebraska that, there are plentiful food resources. We're a big state, but there's a limit to how many deer people want to hit with their car.
Sure.
How much
Yeah.
corn crop they want to have
Sure.
deer consume. And so social tolerance is a slightly different matter than the actual biological carrying
Sure.
capacity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we take that into account for sure, because like I said, their existence here in this state has to work within the agricultural landscape and work for the people of Nebraska. They are a native species. We want to have a resilient population, but it has to work with the people that are here.
And I think one of the misconceptions that you just covered was that the Game and Parks is wanting to work with those landowners and make sure, hey, if we're having a problem with a certain individual, we will take care of it to the benefit of your operation. So I think that's really important to point out.
Yeah. And that's one of the things actually yesterday at our Natural Resource Conservation Connecting Points workshop, I was talking with some other Game and Parks folks. And one of the things that we discussed was just that works really well that you guys are doing is working with the public and being able to engage with them. Because ultimately, like you said, 98% of the land's privately owned. Yep. And so we got to work with our landowners. And so I say all that just to say that I know you guys do a really good job of that through every year having meetings with folks and the general public to get input. And so I think that's a really important point. So,
yeah. So would you say we're around that good balanced population right now, as far from the social aspect, from the wildlife populations that we have that are preyed upon?
I think we've been there in past years. There are some challenges. And so, we had Game and Parks had issues with depredation from big game species, and we're asked to reduce some big game numbers, which we did. And we think, I think our design was the right amount, but there are other challenges where we have issues with CWD and deer, chronic wasting disease. Sure. And then also, unfortunately, we've been hit by drought for about 3 years in a row. And so, I think when I attended big game meetings in the Pine Ridge and in the Wildcat Hills area, both where we have mountain lions, deer numbers are down or below what people want to have. Sure. People who are interested in hunting and attend those meetings. And so, of course, when deer numbers are down, then the focus turns to, and we're also seeing quite a lot of lions. And so my perception is that social tolerance for lions right now is lower than the number likely is. And so that's something that we can manage through our harvest seasons. Sure. We have had hunting seasons for mountain lions in Nebraska since 2014. So we're 10 years into it now. Yep.
And that's something I'd like to touch on a little more is that hunting season. We do, as you said, in fact, harvest mountain lions. How do you decide the number of species, the number of individuals that we harvest each year?
Yep. Lots of math and lots of research, lots of trail cameras and lots of GPS collars and cougar scat samples. And so, like back to our earlier conversation, it's trying to count species that's difficult to count.
Sure.
But we do know, we can use techniques like looking at the amount of suitable habitat. So the Pine Ridge, I'm going to use as the example because we've done the most research there. But the Pine Ridge, people who've been up there, gorgeous landscape, perfect for lions. Yep. And it is bordered by shortgrass prairie, which is not good lion habitat at all. A lion can walk across that to get up to the Black Hills, but it's not going to make its living out on the shortgrass prairie. Sure. So it's fairly simple to measure the amount of habitat that's in the Pine Ridge.
Oh, yeah.
And then to try to make sure if we had the right number, you can imagine taking a cookie cutter and punching that size area out of the Black Hills. Well, they've done research in the Black Hills. Sure. They know the density there, and they've done research in Wyoming. And so, we can use all those techniques to try to figure out how many lions are up there. But I kind of lost myself in conversation. What was your question?
The
limit.
Right? The limit. Yes.
So then once you run your surveys and create population estimates, you have a kind of a intrinsic growth rate of the population. So if the population is going to produce excess individuals, those can likely be harvested. And it's something similar you do with other game species like deer. But then we have brackets for our social tolerance. So how many we think the people in the Pine Ridge are willing to accept on their ranches. And so it's every year it's kind of a custom fit for what is social tolerance? How many comments are we getting from ranchers? Have we had any issues with depredation? Do we think we have more lions where we could raise the limit because we have a higher number of lions than we have in the past? Or, did something happen? Have we had a lot of other mortalities, roadkill, lions killing other lions and that kind of thing. And so maybe we need to pull back. So we adjusted every year to make sure the lion population is resilient and healthy over the long term. So lions are native and they're going to be here, but within a kind of a bracket that the people in the Pine Ridge are willing to accept.
Yeah, so truly adaptive management.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Which is important. So, are there often incidental kills outside of hunting season? Does that happen quite often?
It does, yeah, and for a myriad of reasons. So, we've had everything from wildfires. There've been huge wildfires in Pine Ridge 2012, in particular, but even smaller fires where we had a female and her kittens in a canyon that burned, and those animals perished in that wildfire. And of course, that's a natural occurrence. But it's something we've documented in roadkill, and we've had some disease issues, and sometimes lions die, and we do a necropsy, and we can't determine why. But all kinds of different causes. Yep.
Yeah.
Including hunting seasons, of course.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. One thing I was curious about, and this is because I do a lot of work with GPS data. So, what are, for people listening out there, like, you noted before, like they can move up to upwards of 20 miles in a day in those canyons. What are some of the furthest movements that you guys have observed with having those GPS collars on lions?
It's been really fascinating, especially for me. I've been in this position almost 20 years now, which I can hardly believe I'm saying. But, when I started, you would get these long distance dispersers. They're almost always young males. So you could think of them in person terms as sort of a teenager that it's too old to stay in its mother's territory. It has to go kick out. And young males want to walk hundreds of miles. And they think that helps with genetic diversity. If they're always walking hundreds of miles, they never become, genetically isolated. Anyway, there have been animals that ended up in eastern Nebraska. We had one in South Sioux City soon after I started back in 2004, which is a long ways from the Black Hills or the Pine Ridge.
Sure.
Yeah. And then on into Iowa and other states. But when we collared them, we actually, or even some of the ear tag work, we got insight into where these animals are coming from and how far they go. So probably the best example I can give you is we collared a mountain lion near Valentine, Nebraska in the Niobrara River Valley. And that cat, when it finally grew up to the point where it was going to leave its mother, walked down into the sandhills all the way out to Hyannis, which is west central sandhills. And then it didn't like that. And I'm sure that's a tiring walk for a lion, and there's not a lot of trees out there.
Sure.
So it walked back up to the Niobrara Valley. And then I was sitting in my office one day and I got a call. Hey, I got a video of a mountain lion on my security camera in my driveway here just outside of Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. I need to take a look. And then the person said, yeah, and it's got a collar on.
Oh,
oh my God. Anyway, the collar had malfunctioned for a bit, so I didn't get all the. I didn't know it was here.
Sure, yeah.
But then it left the Lincoln area and swam across the Missouri River and walked all the way across Iowa and walked into Illinois. And finally, I saw a location in Springfield, Illinois, and had to call the Department of Fish and Game there.
Wow.
That animal actually was collected and sent to a cat, like a cat care facility, basically for big cats. But it walked a long ways.
That is an incredibly long ways.
Yeah. That is wild.
And that is amazing.
A quick second example would be we had a call from Minnesota DNR, and they said, "Hey, we had a mountain lion that was run over in Minneapolis, and it's got ear tags on that start with for Nebraska." So I said, "Okay, give me the number," and it had started its. We tagged it as a kitten in the Pine Ridge.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So
that's incredible.
Those young animals can cover enormous distances.
Sure.
And of course, they're looking for females, and females spread out more slowly.
Sure.
The mother will tolerate them living in part of their home range, or maybe they just kick over 20 miles. So these males that go east, they're not finding females because there aren't populations there. So they're going to keep walking until they find a female, which they really have to get down to Florida to find a female, or they're going to keep walking until they die, or or turn back maybe.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing.
Do you have other states that are reaching out to you saying, "Hey, we see this mountain lion coming into your state"? Is there a lot of conversation back and forth like that among states?
We do all communicate. Yeah, I know. Like when I started, the Black Hills in South Dakota Game Fish and Parks was running a mountain lion research project, and they had collared individuals and ear tagged individuals. And in fact, the first female mountain lion that got harvested in Nebraska was wearing an ear tag from South Dakota.
Really?
So it's
wow.
Yeah, we certainly communicate and go to the same meetings and give each other a heads up if we think someone needs to know something.
That's cool. Yeah.
That's really neat. Yeah, I didn't
Speaks
realize
to the
that.
point of, this cross boundary movements. And,
Right.
these animals obviously know no boundaries and
Right.
just,
And then I guess I'd use that point to say that, we've had some criticism for holding harvest seasons on mountain lions in Nebraska since they're somewhat new here. But the Pine Ridge population I see as an extension of the population in the Mountain West that goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, has 30,000 some mountain lions in it. But, our collaring project and our ear tagging of kittens has shown that our mountain lions move up to the Black Hills. We've got one of the Black Hills right now, and mountain lions from there move down into Nebraska, and mountain lions from Wyoming and Colorado come up into Nebraska, and our lions go back there. And so they're genetically really connected. We're just part of a giant population that covers, 14 states and Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. Yeah, and thinking about that larger population as a whole. So
we're not like Florida where you have
still isolated. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it's really cool with the GPS data. Like even with our turkey project right now, we've had some of our turkeys moving upwards of 17 to 20 some miles from where we capture them at out in western part of the state. And you're going, well, I can't imagine a bird of that size will go that far, and they do. They just follow a lot of those drainages along. And so, that data really has revolutionized the way we can kind of think about their just general ecology and such. So,
Yeah, that's neat. So I would say like just the traveling and just the back and forth across state boundaries for mountain lions is a misconception. Are there any other misconceptions around the species that you would want to cover, just get out to the general public while you have their ear?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's the common one that has been here since before I even started this job. So I grew up in Nebraska, and I had heard that game and parks reintroduced lions, which is of course false. As the example from the GPS collars and the ear tag, you can clearly see lions walk hundreds of miles. And the Pine Ridge is, if you stand on the bluffs of the Pine Ridge, you can see the Black Hills, which is one of the source populations. So just to make clear to anyone listening that these animals just walked back in from Colorado, Wyoming, and South Dakota, our neighboring states with huge lion populations. And so they walked back in on their own, and they are native here. And then, another kind of misconception was that, and I don't know why I still get this comment at times, but, kind of game and parks, I'll see it on Facebook or something, but it's game and parks denies lions are in Nebraska, and it's like, I guess it's important to point out, hey, we've had hunting seasons since 2014. First flying in 1991. And so we do ask the public to provide information if they have observations. So I'd encourage everybody to do that as well. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Do you get any misconceptions between people who have photos like a bobcat and mountain lion? Like they see a bobcat and they think that's a mountain lion?
Yep. Yeah. And so that can happen to anyone. Before the podcast, I gave the example for myself that I hunt deer, and I'll be looking at some buckbrush on a hillside, and it's clear in broad daylight that that's buckbrush. And then at sunset, it suddenly becomes antler. I get really excited. So we have some just honest mistakes. And sometimes on trail camera pictures, you can tell that it's a cat, but it's hard to tell which species it is. But of course, you have little cues you can look at. Like, for instance, bobcats have white patches on the back of their ears, and lions, the patches on the back of their ears are black. So even if you can't see the long J-shaped tail of a mountain lion or the dark spots that some bobcats have, not all bobcats, there are other things you can look at. And I'm happy to help anybody out. We love it if they send us information and pictures and trail camera photos.
That's really cool. Yeah, personally, I thought I saw one like we were talking before, and it ended up being a golden retriever running up a hill, and I'm like, dang it. Because I want to see one in the wild on foot so bad, but unfortunately it's never happened.
They're real secretive. It's hard to see. I haven't seen one in the wild in Nebraska either, unless, as I pointed out, our dogs ran it up a tree or it was in one of our traps. But I've never just seen one out in the wild.
Just down about it. And that's interesting because then you're doing all this work on them, for a number of years. And so it's to say that, absolutely. You're out there and you're not seeing them. So they are very secretive.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does the future research look like here in Nebraska? Where are you guys headed there?
Well, we gathered enough information on impacts on big game species, and we determined home ranges already. And so now we're looking at changes in distribution. So our mountain lions moving into new areas. And we had one instance of reproduction up in the northeast Missouri River Bluffs, kind of near Ponca and Maskell in that area. There are really good hardwood forests along the Missouri River Bluffs with lots of deer that a lion came and found that. And we had one litter in that area, but have not detected any since then. So, we're going to be looking at, our lions expanding or contracting. And then also we're going to continue looking at dispersal and try to figure out if,
Sure.
What sort of dispersal paths are and characterize dispersal more. So that's kind of what's coming up in the next few years. And then of course we continue with the population estimates because we need that for management to keep the population at a level that works for lions themselves, but also the people in Nebraska.
Yeah, that's good.
Absolutely.
That's really
No, I think it's a really neat topic and awesome research. So I appreciate you guys coming in and sharing all that information.
Jason, do you want to share any other things that were notable from your work before we wrap up?
Oh man, it's a lot of work to do a project like this. So
Sure.
It was a really good experience for me. But no, it was just really cool. Overall just seeing, some of the smaller species that get consumed. I mean, it's kind of like we were talking earlier, like they can be pretty opportunistic, if they walk, if a cougar's walking along and a rabbit comes out, they can take advantage of that. And so I thought that was really interesting. But that's pretty much all I have.
No, that's good. Yeah. And I was going to say, just add to that, I think there's probably maybe a misconception sometimes of just that they're specifically only targeting just deer, for example. And so ultimately your work really showed that they're opportunistic. They're kind of finding what they can find out there. Sure, maybe it's more predominant for certain species, but ultimately they're eating a lot of different things. I think that's important to share that information. So I think that's cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I did find, not a lot, but there were smaller occurrences of, I have had it down as ovis. So either, there's bighorn sheep up there.
Oh, sure.
There's also domestic sheep, and I couldn't determine the difference between the two under the microscope. Unfortunately, it's kind of like the mule deer and the whitetail deer kind of thing. So that, and then small occurrence of elk as well. So those species are up there as well. So they they could consume that too. But no, just not the frequency numbers weren't there as as compared to deer. So
you don't get to necessarily go out and capture animals and spend all your time out in the field. You got to spend some time behind a microscope.
I did. I spent a lot of time behind a microscope. But no, I was pretty fortunate, back when I was a wildlife technician, I worked for the Game Parks Commission, and I did get to do a lot of that, help out with a lot of that mountain lion research work. I mean, it's, just stuff you'll never forget.
Absolutely.
It's life moments,
Absolutely.
So, really good.
I'd imagine so.
Absolutely.
Speaking of microphone, I want to thank Jason for being willing to take on this challenge, microscope. I want to thank Jason for being willing to take on that challenge, because I tried to look at the dorsal guard hairs myself, and those patterns he's looking at for each hair are basically like reading a small foreign language. And it's a lot of time and a lot of headache, and he did it, and we appreciate the work. So
thank you, Sam. Yeah, I know. Another thing I can mention too, like you saying, it's a foreign language looking underneath that microscope. I mean, a lot of different species as well. Because I was messing around looking at black bear hair.
Really?
Because I, had some experience with black bear research as well from other technician jobs, and but anyway, different species of hair, it all has different characteristics, and some of that's really opaque and it's hard to see. So you'd almost have to I used some clearing agents, like paraffin oil, and another one was xylene. They kind of worked, but you would actually have to cut open the hair, let that kind of disperse within that medulla structure. And then you could actually see some of those cells and what it looks like.
That's pretty cool.
That was challenging. And some other species, I was surprised, there wasn't anything. I didn't find any coyote. Because that was found in other diet research. But that was one of the species that it's super opaque. I mean, you look under a microscope and it just looks like a black line. So trying to open that up so you can actually see what it is. That was tough with some some species. So
That's really cool. Yeah, because again, and we're actually here shortly. We're going to do another episode on just how do research projects come to fruition and kind of
Sure.
talk through that, because I think that sometimes you don't really fully grasp all that unless you're in this research realm. And to think about things like that, I would not have thought about some of those complexities that you were able to experience. So
and I'm sure if you guys have research experience, you kind of learn. It's kind of a learn as you go.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
and that was really hard for me. When I started, is because you want everything to be non-biased and perfect, and it kind of can slow you down sometimes.
Sure.
But eventually, I got the wheels moving, and you just kind of start, and especially with this kind of stuff, teach yourself how to do it. Look at different resources, and then you just learn as you go. So
that's super cool.
Yeah,
that's
and it helps too when you find bone fragments or
I'm sure
shells. That really helps.
Oh, I'm sure. It makes it easier on you. Yeah, that's really cool.
Well, first of all, I'm happy that you guys are here, number one, but thank you for doing the research and putting in the time.
Thank you so much.
As Sam said, it's really turned into some neat information, and I'm excited to get it out to the public. And I'm sure we're probably going to have some questions about it, so we might have to have you guys back on in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.